Welcome back to our channel. Today we're going to be talking about albums from the year of 1979. When you were listening to these albums, what's kind of the context you could glean from the music about kind of what was going on in 1979 for trends in music and even like just history?
Well, disco was a clear trend, though it might have been petering out a little bit at this time. But another trend probably was actually the death of prog rock. Death is a funny phrase because prog rock has been essentially like still going on even till today. It's a thriving genre. But the specific like form of prog rock that was kind of adjacent to fusion was definitely kind of petering out at this time.
By the end of the 70s, it was kind of like getting overdone because you had like a lot of these bands kind of like making the same sort of album structure where they'd have like intro song, longer second track, more improvisationally weird third track or fourth track, and then bringing it all back together with a fifth track, and it was like very concise, this kind of like big sprawling opus type thing that many bands were doing, and I think that it was getting stale by the end of the 70s.
Yeah.
Even the bands that were doing that started to move on and started to make different music.
It really did seem like there's a certain structure or form of the genre, and then that form was just kind of overdone. Though I do think that there were still some really good bands, even into the early 80s, that kind of wrapped that sound into the post-punk sound a little bit, and had almost more complex grooves, music that had almost no ambience to it. It was like very precise and staccato. And I feel like prog rock almost got enveloped into that through bands like Jethro Tull and Gentle Giant, just to name two. So
yeah,
it was definitely a genre that was changing, not necessarily dying as a whole, but the old form was dying.
But I'd say like the big genres that were at the height of the 70s were definitely prog rock, the kind of Pink Floyd vein, and disco.
And fusion as well.
And fusion funk, that kind of thing. And by the end of the 70s, I think a lot of those trends were ending. Like pretty drastically by 1979, you can tell there's like still these albums being made, but there's like the majority of the music coming out I found was different. It was more complicated. It was more experimental. It was moving into just various random different directions. So I found there's a lot of really weird and experimental and avant-garde music in 79.
Yeah, it seemed like they were kind of searching for a new sound because the sounds of the 70s they were getting kind of bored of.
Yeah, I found post-punk as just a broad genre was kind of the genre of this year in many ways. Like it took on many forms. You have the Joy Division style of post-punk, which is very like kind of
gothic rock aligned.
Yeah, it's gothic. It's very like muted, staccato. Yeah, as you say, no ambience, just completely dry sounding music and very depressing, and lyrics that are very like dealing with like mental health, depression and like the state of the world as it is kind of now, which was in many people's view hopeless. And so you have that kind of post-punk, but then there's other post-punk that I found goes more into jazz territory, and it explores like more avant-garde music. There's it's not on my list unfortunately, but there's this one album that kind of goes into free jazz territory, the pop group's Why, very interesting album. There's others that experiment with ambient music, and so they have like post-punk at times, but then they have tracks full of like crazy swaths of just ambience or like strange music concrete. So for that I'm thinking of this one band called This Heat, but there's a couple of others that I'm going to talk about on my list. But that was a big genre. But yeah, death of disco, death of prog rock, and then I'd say like there was some emergence of like country and that kind of thing as well, and folk music kind of coming back, which I know got really big in the 80s.
Yeah.
But you can kind of see that a little bit, and also new wave starting as well.
New wave, that's a big one. You have things like synth wave and all of those kind of as predecessors to new wave, and at the same time, you have a lot of bands that are kind of the more poppy side of new wave that kind of bring in elements of disco, bring in elements of jazz, like the saxophone solos that are just like peak new wave.
Yeah.
And bands like ELO and Supertramp are like really big ones for like the kind of art rock, pop rock, new wave scene.
They almost distilled down the prog rock epics into like shorter 3 to 4 minute pop tracks.
Yeah.
But they keep a lot of the elements the same, but like it's now just more of a almost radio friendly version of it.
For sure, yeah.
And yeah, you mentioned synthwave. That's a big one because I found doing a bit of research, like so krautrock was really big in the early 70s and
Yeah.
like late 60s in Germany, West Germany, because there was still the schism at that time.
Mhm.
And West Germany was kind of finding a new musical identity to separate themselves from like the World War II era Germany, because there's a lot of people who were young, right, and like just were kind of disgusted with their country's history, and they're like, need to have a new artistic movement here, and so they just experimented a ton with like random various genres, and then so in kind of America, it was like krautrock, which is kind of actually an offensive term, but
It is.
but that's just what the genre has become known as, or kosmische music. But that's like cosmic music. That's the German word that they like to use, but still people hated that term because it was like trying to boil down a million genres into one.
Mhm.
But that music really, really influenced America and like the UK in the late 70s. And so, like for example, I think a big artist that brought that into the mainstream was David Bowie with his Berlin trilogy, like Low and Heroes, and Lodger, but to a lesser extent. And like that really influenced a lot of bands that started to make synthwave.
For sure, because a lot of it has like those kind of synth pads or just like ambience in general, which was interesting that was going on in Europe, whereas there's like a lot of very particular staccato kind of post-punk music going on in the experimentation phase in the West. Very interesting.
Yeah, plus also, I guess you have like artists like Brian Eno, who by the late 70s just switched completely to making ambient music and kind of invented it as a genre.
Yeah.
That influenced a lot of artists too. I mean, he was literally the one who produced and added synth work to those David Bowie albums. And so all that was kind of combining to move music into a more electronic direction, which in the 80s kind of exploded.
Yeah.
But in the 70s, it's kind of cool to see it in this year kind of beginning. Right. So now let's get into it. So what was your number 5, or your 5th favorite album of 1979?
So this album for me would be Stormwatch by Jethro Tull, who I've already mentioned. It's pretty much a prog rock album, or more apt genre label would be flute rock, which was a pretty big genre during like the fusion, like that crossover between fusion and prog rock, which is really big in the 70s. They're kind of taking that sound, doing something that one of my favorite prog rock bands, Gentle Giant, also did, which is bringing in kind of medieval elements into the music, be that like strings or like plucked guitar, and just like or just different modes that were used in the medieval times, and themes as well. Often in this album, you get themes. There's even a song called Dark Age or Dark Ages, 9-minute track, and but this album, which has a lot of tracks in it, it's a pretty long album, is it has a lot of variety. I feel like every track kind of hits different and like has its own kind of flares. It brings in almost early like metal elements or like hard rock kind of elements in there as well, that are really fun to hear, because like I just love that kind of new wave of British heavy metal sound, and they bring in those elements really well, but like they integrate them in a very creative way that keeps the prog rock sound kind of authentic, without having those elements kind of come in there, without having those elements overtake the elements of prog rock that I like.
The late 70s are kind of an era where I'd say the new wave of British heavy metal was really kicking off, and it became huge in the 80s. Of course, it's kind of rock became back in the mainstream to kind of replace disco, I guess, in many ways. What would you say makes this album in particular stand out among the other kind of new wave of British heavy metal / prog rock albums from this time?
I think it was mainly the medieval elements. It's very fantasy-esque album, almost how later on you'd have power metal bring in a lot of very fantasy themes and elements into their music. This album definitely did that as well, and I just find that, I don't know, it connects to me because I really like medieval and fantasy and all of that.
Fair enough. Cool. So I guess we'll go to my number 5. A very different album, but so after kind of getting into this guy's music for the first time this month, I just knew I had to put him on this list somewhere, because the impact just learning about this guy and listening to his music had on me. So this would be, of course, Frank Zappa's "Shake Your Booty."
Nice.
So I mean, just looking at this album cover just makes me laugh. It just has like this energy to it. He looks so serious, and like, you know, just the level of wit and like sarcasm and like irony and like comedy on this album is really funny. Like, you have some absolutely batshit songs like Bobby Brown's Going Down, or like I don't know, I'm So Cute, or like Broken Hearts Over Assholes, you know, and they're just like, you know, they're sung in earnest. Like, they're sung as if they're making like serious, you know, rock music. but like the lyrics are absurd and like very offensive and very like obviously like sexual, explicitly sexual in nature kind of thing. They're all like poking fun at a certain type of American or like a certain type of person, or like, and just trying to like aggravate and kind of like piss off conservatives. It's kind of the vibe that I get from a lot of this. It's very entertaining music, but like not even just the lyrics though. Like musically and instrumentally, like his music's really complex, very interesting, very like progressive, and just really awesome to listen to. And this album in particular, first off, I have to address the album title. It's kind of like a making fun of this one really famous disco track from a couple of years before this, obviously called "Shake Your Booty," and so but it looks like it's some kind of Middle Eastern text.
I still know. I could not. I can't believe it that like I listened to this album and like saw the title. I didn't really pay it too much heed, and I was like, okay, this is like some Middle Eastern name or something.
He totally trolled you.
He totally trolled me, and then when you read it out, it's like, what?
That's what it is. Yeah. But yeah, like, so this album's cool instrumentally because it has like these sort of like shorter comedy tracks, I guess, if you want to call it that. They're more than that, but they also have like live tracks on this album. It's a mixture of studio and live music. And so you have like this, kind of track near the middle of it. I can't remember exactly what it's called now. Rat Tomato or something like that. It's like a weird name like that, but it's like a really long track that's entirely live and instrumental and really interesting. And then you have like the, Shake Your Booty Tango, which is also in a similar vein to that. And yeah, some really interesting live tracks. So like this album is very explorative. It's rock music, but it has so many cool elements in it that almost remind me of like Captain Beefheart at times.
Yeah, totally.
And so really interesting, really good music, and also extremely funny. So have to have him on the list.
Yeah, so I definitely laughed quite a few times when listening to that album.
Yeah, there's just some outright like absurd lines. We're just like, what? Yeah, I was actually reading the lyrics for a lot of these songs just because I felt like I had to get the full picture.
Yeah.
But yeah, I also listened to Joe's Garage Act 1, but I just found like this album was the stronger one. But same year, he was very prolific in 1979. He did the entire Joe's Garage series, which is like a triple album. So but yeah. Anyway, on to your number 4. What was your fourth favorite 79?
My fourth is Solid State Survivor by Yellow Magic Orchestra. It's a synthwave album, but to call it that would be like would simplify it down a little bit too much. I think it goes a lot of different areas. At one part, it almost had like bluesy progression to it, and it deploys like tons of different instruments, many different styles. It has that robot voice effect at times, which you might recognize from Daft Punk.
Totally.
I also recognized it from ELO, which used the same effect. But yeah, really fun album. I feel like it's like incredibly complex at times, but at the same time keeps that kind of nostalgic simplicity of like early minimalistic ambient music. This is an ambient album by any means, but it has those kind of same
a couple
synths.
Tracks that you could call ambient, but
Yeah.
But still, okay. I want to mention right now before we move on too much. This is my number 4 as well, so we might as well just talk about this together as like ours,
perfect.
'cause that's hilarious. Yeah,
Wow.
I was amazed by this album. I thought it was the best. I listened to a lot of synthwave, but this was my favorite. I think it was the peak.
Same. Yeah.
And I think the thing that makes it stand out among the others is the production. Production is insanely good. It feels like modern. Like listening to it now, I'm like, wow, these synths are produced so well.
I think there's a lot of like variety in his production too. It's not just like a single. Like at times, it's produced almost like psych rock, which really confused me. It was like, what the heck? But you also had elements that were very almost post-punk in how it was produced, with like those kind of staccato elements as well, and the drums. And then of course you have lots of synth work with, I'm not sure if they are Moog synths, but definitely like older synths being used. That kind of gave me almost like at times alien vibes. In like, I remember playing this game. It's called like Grabatronic or something. It was like an iPod game or something when I was really young. It was essentially you flew around this UFO like that had a claw in it. You picked up things and threw people and all of that.
Yeah.
And that music, the soundtrack in that game, it just like I just was like thrown back to that like 10 years, and I was like, whoa, big nostalgia.
It's funny that you mentioned like a video game, because this music to me sounds like kind of 90s or 2000s video game music in many ways. Like, and this band, they're like a trio from Japan, right? And like maybe their music, I actually don't look into it, but I imagine the music probably inspired some like Nintendo game soundtrack.
I can see
it really has this sort of like feel to it, right? Like, the songs are very buoyant, they're very driving, they're very fun, and also catchy at times too.
Yeah.
There's some tracks that are still going through my head today, like from
same.
that album. Like, so yeah. incredibly fun and also very short. It's like
Yeah.
So I don't know. I found like no moments were wasted, and I could listen to this album back to back again. So.
Same, yeah.
Yeah.
Also, there's a point at which they had a descending scale that was like really cool to me. Like technically, it was a whole tone scale is what it was doing. So they were just going down in whole tones, which is very, very rarely used scale. You'd find it sometimes in like impressionistic music, and rarely outside of that. It's a very interesting scale, and so I was like, "This is a whole tone scale." I don't know. That just gave me like a level of like technical excitement, I guess you could call it. But,
yeah,
that's
fair enough. Yeah, really cool album. I'm glad that we both have that on our list and at the same spot. Very interesting.
That's really cool.
We didn't talk about our lists at all to each other.
No,
We're trying to keep it secret.
Yeah, secret.
But that's cool. So I'm actually intrigued if there's any other matches. What was your number 3?
My number 3, I know, is not on your list.
Okay.
Because it doesn't. It's actually like very obscure. It is Disco Frisco by Stefan Stefensen.
Okay. Yeah, definitely not on my list.
So this is an Icelandic jazz artist. I found them last year when listening to a bunch of Icelandic jazz, and I was like, at first I thought this actually was released the year of because it was put on Spotify the year of, and
they thought it was from 2021.
So I thought it was 2021.
It sounds that like modern.
Yeah. And I was like, oh, this is like a fun callback to disco music and like very modern production and very good songs. Like I could see this being modern. So I just believed it. I just believed it was 2021. And then I learned later, this was disco era music then. Okay, that makes a lot more sense.
Okay, instead of a throwback.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of these kind of throwbacks happening now. So it's fair to believe that.
Yeah.
That's funny.
Anyways, this album has so many bangers on it. And like I find myself coming back to like the melodies in these songs. And of course, because it's Icelandic jazz, the lyrics, not all the songs have lyrics, but the lyrics are very, are in Icelandic. And because of that, you almost don't focus on them as much or like focus on the meaning. And it also just isn't as cheesy as a lot of disco is, I find. A lot of disco is very on the nose about its themes. And I think that this music, because you don't really care about the lyrics anymore because you don't understand them, it makes it so you can focus on the musical elements and the vibes, I guess you could call it, like the overall energy. And because of that, it just brought out a lot of the melodies. You also have a crossover between a lot of fusion and prog rock elements, especially fusion, like Herbie Hancock almost level fusion, being brought into this album and like those technical elements, while also having like really fun guitar lines and stuff. Overall, I think this album is just a ton of fun, and certainly probably the most obscure one on the list. But yeah.
Yeah. My number 3.
Yeah, I want to ask you.
Sure.
What's your number 3?
Well, my number 3 is a bit of a predictable one, but it had to be on the list somewhere. That is The Wall by Pink Floyd. So this is an album that when I first got into Pink Floyd, I kind of never really got into that much. I don't know, I favored their kind of mid-70s prog rock instead, like Animals, big album, Wish You Were Here, obviously Dark Side of the Moon, also Metal and Atom Heart Mother. All of those are really good. And for some reason I listened to The Wall and I was like first getting into them and I just like was like, okay, that album's fine, and it just didn't connect with me as much. But this year I actually I have it on vinyl. This is like an original pressing. I just don't listen to it much for whatever reason. And I was like, okay, I'm actually gonna seriously listen to this whole album and try and like understand it. I'm gonna read all the lyrics. I'm gonna like really get into it. And yeah, it's a masterpiece. I mean, it's really, really good. It tells us this like really tragic tale of like kind of a like a rock star with like a dead father who died of the war and a very overprotective mother who basically shelters him and feeds him all of her delusions and paranoia about the world, and he basically becomes like an extreme introvert, very socially awkward and can't form connections. And then he goes into like the kind of British school system at the time, which was very authoritarian and dogmatic and very strict, and he hates his teachers, believes there's no value in education, basically becomes a recluse there, goes into become a rock star, and then has this like really like toxic relationship basically where they're cheating and everything like that. That's what I could glean from it at least. And then he ends up being kind of an abuser, and so he of course gets divorced or like broken up with. And then after that, he basically swears off women, and then goes into a shell of his former self and blocks out the world, and basically becomes like a complete, in our current day, comparable to like basically like QAnon or something like that's really really far down some sort of conspiracy rabbit hole, and then the next half of the album is basically exploring him in that state where he goes into like these delusions of grandeur, where he's like some kind of fascist dictator and he's like ruling over the masses, and he's like taking all the people he doesn't like and executing them or whatever like that, and it's just like this crazy over the top exploration of this person in his like psychosis before it becomes the delusion crashes down and like the characters in his life from the past come in and put him on trial and then declare him guilty, and then the metaphorical wall he's built up to keep him from society collapses, and then the album ends. It's really cool. Like
It is.
The story is fantastic, and I haven't even gotten into the songs, but like there's so many amazing songs in this album too. Like it's sort of like what we were talking about with Supertramp or bands like that, where kind of having in this point in the 70s we're condensing down prog rock into more like smaller slices almost. I found especially on the second half of the album actually. So yeah, some really good cuts, but I'm sure this will be on your list so we can talk more about like the actual songs maybe later on, but I just wanted to bring up kind of my understanding of the concept of this album, which alone makes it amazing. So yeah. Anyway, we'll go on to the second though. What is your number 2?
So my number 2 is the Supertramp album from this year, which you just mentioned.
Breakfast in America.
Breakfast in America, yeah. So Breakfast in America is a really fun album. I feel like it starts out really strong. It has the first bunch of tracks are really good. The reason why it's not my number 1 is because it gets a little weak from like tracks 4 to 6 or something. Middle of the album's a little bit weaker. I don't like dislike the songs, but I do think that they're just not as good. But then it ends with Child of Vision, which is my favorite song of the year. And it's just an amazing. I'll just go into it a little bit. So it starts out with like pretty normal track with some really nice like melodies and really like dramatic harmonies and such. But then it's like a 7-minute track, I think. And after a certain point, like halfway point or something, the basic song structure of it kind of just is done. It's like, okay, the song's done. Now just time for a really intense jam session with like an amazing piano line, great groove with the bass, and then the saxophone coming in at the end, like ambient saxophone that's really dissonant and like intense. It's an excellent way to end the album, and I feel like because it ends so strongly and like starts so strongly, I had to put it on my list, and yeah, I think this album definitely deserves its spot on number 2.
My number 2 is probably one you didn't listen to. It's a little more obscure, not as obscure as your Icelandic jazz pick, Stefansson. Yeah. So this album is by James Chance and the Contortions, and it's a no-wave album called Bye. And it, just from like the first track, it's insane. It's not like no wave and like the early Swans no wave. That's like really like brutal and like industrial and like loud and percussion heavy. This is like free jazz exploration kind of thing. It's very chaotic music. It has rock instruments. It also has jazz instruments, and it uses a lot of dissonance. And the tracks are just like a swirl of just chaos and like insanity for every track, basically. And that's the album. And then like the singer kind of like shouts and barks and like screams, and like that's kind of the singing style. But I found the energy on this album to be so electrifying, so crazy. The instrumentals to be like so experimental and like so engaging. And this album was like really really impressive for me. So very cool to see something like this happening. This no doubt went on to influence a lot of artists that were making sort of more experimental post-punk, and beyond. But there's even a bit of like Pixies vibes I get with this album as well, even though they wouldn't come for another decade or so. And so kind of funny. And I'd say, oddly enough, like my number 1 album of 2021, Squid's Bright Green Field, and this album share a lot of similarities, where I'm like, this almost sounds like proto Squid. I'm sure they're a bigger band than Squid is right now, but like very interesting. And yeah, so James Chance is kind of the guy who basically starts this band. He's actually a saxophonist, and then he also made this band, and he does play saxophone on quite a bit of these songs. But for just this one album, his band was called The Contortions. But he went on to just be James Chance and make music under that name for the rest of his career, which was a very long career. So very cool. So that's my number 2.
Before number 1s,
we should
talk about honorable mentions.
Honorable mentions.
So my honorable mentions are Go West by Village People. I found this album just incredibly fun. It didn't have a lot of variety in it, but I feel like the first 3 tracks in it are just, they just get better and better. And so I had to include this one. It's just peak disco for me. My second honorable mention would be 20 Jazz Funk Greats by Throbbing Gristle.
What a band name.
This album surprised me with how ahead of its time it was. Like I was like, this is not a 90s album. It was very strange. It was like an industrial album with a lot of very experimental elements. And it was not jazz or funk, but it was great.
This is one of my honorable mentions as well,
Yeah,
so I want to pipe in. This album, when I listened to it a couple times, the first time I listened to it, I was like expecting something darker, because like I already kind of knew the story about the fact, oh, it's a joke. Like they have like this 60s pastiche kind of album cover that's actually taken out a popular Suicide spot in the UK. And then like it's the band all like happy, and then it's the 20 Jazz Funk Greats, like it's like some kind of like bargain bin album that some grandma would pick up.
Yeah.
And it's like really, it's supposed to be like really dark, haunting music. And when I listened to it the first time, I was like, oh, okay, that wasn't that bad. Like I was expecting something like more Nine Inch Nails aligned, but no, industrial music was not that yet. It was like more almost like a darker synthwave type of sound that was like squelchy synths, just general weirdness and like an unsettling vibe. And so when I listened to this more, I started to get that more. And so I distinctly remember, it was a few nights ago, after listening to that album during the day, I had the track "What a Day" stuck in my mind like all night, and it was just like, it was like giving me anxiety. Like that track, if you remember it, like has like this like really repetitive like kind of like electronic like kind of reverberation going on, and then you have like the singer just starting like "What a day, what a day, what a day," and like that album, something about that song is so creepy. Like I don't know, it just gets under my skin. And then there's another track too. I think it's called Persuasion, and it uses like creepy like female screams as like some sort of distorted instrument. Like it's horrifying. I'm like, what the hell? And also the lyrics are like about like some guy with an obsession with panties or something. Yeah. It's very creepy, and like so like the album I feel like on the surface doesn't seem that dark, but like when you actually start listening to it more, it's just like it really is unnerving. I almost put it in my top 5.
Yeah, same. I was considering that for the 5th spot. And then I've got 2 more. The first is, I want to get the name right, Feel No Fret and More is an album by Average White Band, is what they're called.
Okay.
They're like a blue-eyed soul / disco band that brings in a lot of kind of, I don't know if prog rock elements, but like they bring in kind of those elements into it, a bit more rock of a sound. And it's just a really fun sound. I was going to put this as like my 4th or 5th choice, but then I re-listened to it and it was like, okay, this isn't that great. But I do like the sound a lot. I find it very fun. And then, of course, I have to include I Am by Earth, Wind & Fire. Just a completely classic disco band, like, and obviously one of my favorites. And this sound, even though obviously it would be the reverse in terms of what actually influenced what, but this sound reminded me a lot of Thundercat, which is one of my favorite bands. So I was like, oh, cool, Thundercat vibes, but from the 80s and a little bit more disco. I'm vibing.
Okay, so my honorable mentions would be, the Throbbing Gristle album, but also I'd have to mention the B-52s self-titled album. Just very weird, funny, kind of like Talking Heads aligned. You just listen to the song Rock Lobster. It's just, it's hilarious and bizarre. And I love the kind of 60s pastiche that they're doing. Yeah. They're like almost like satirizing the 60s, but also making really good music at the same time. So very fun. Another one would be Tusk by Fleetwood Mac. So it's a really long album. It's a double album, and it's them kind of experimenting after the really popular and successful Rumors from 1977. And so you kind of have like almost like the Beatles' White Album sort of feel to this, where it's like, they have like 3 different songwriters in the band, and they each kind of have their own cuts on this album, making that roughly a third each. And so, I was looking at kind of the Wikipedia page and seeing like who wrote each song as I was listening to it, and you really get a distinct different sound from each writer. It's almost like pre-indie folk sort of music. It's very emotional, very mellow, and just very nice to listen to, if not a bit too long. That's my only criticism. I want to quickly mention Gary Newman's Pleasure Principle. Almost made it onto my list, but I just found that Yellow Magic Orchestra was just the better synth wave band. just by a bit. Like Gary Newman is really good though, and Two Boy Army is also really awesome as a project. But yeah, but okay, so I want to mention 2 more albums that I found were the most experimental albums that I heard this year, for sure. And one of them is This Heat, their self-titled album. Just really weird, almost like music concrete type stuff that's going on, with like electronic music and almost like sounding like what do you call it? Dial-up sounds and like weird like frequencies mixed with like really compressed and like mulched up sounding post-punk. It's very cool. I found the album was a little too bizarre to almost like really appreciate. I probably need to listen to it more, but that's why it's not on my top 5. I think it would be too premature to put it there, but it's a really cool album. And then the second, the most unique album I heard this year by far, is Robert Ashley's Automatic Writing. So this is an album, it's just 1 track, 47 minutes, and it's barely music, it's music concrete. It's essentially background noise. It's 47 minutes of background noise. It's as if someone put a camera recorder in someone's house and just, you hear stuff happening, like people walking around, people blabbing and talking, and it just kind of sounds like nonsense in the channels. And you hear sometimes the music in another room sort of playing with like these kind of like, calm synths or whatever. And then you hear like, shuffling and background noise and outside air. It's just it was such a weird, tranquil and calm experience. Barely music, but like, in a way also it is music. It's very strange. And so this was like definitely an experience that I just had to put on there. It was very unique. So now, our
number ones, yeah.
What is your number 1?
My number 1, as we've already talked about, is The Wall by Pink Floyd.
Let's get it back out.
It's long been close to my heart. I don't know, I really appreciate concept albums in general. I think that they're really meaningful, like pieces of art in a way that like non-concept albums, I guess you could call them, they just don't have that element. And so I really appreciate that. But I do think that this album, in many ways, is like a medley, almost like Abbey Road is for the last half. It's like a bunch of just really good tracks that flow into each other amazingly well, tell a story throughout them, and just keep you listening for the whole album. And it's pretty long, but it never feels that long. Yeah, I really think that this album just has like so many tracks that just blow me out of the water. Like, for example, my latest favorite is Run Like Hell. But I feel like my favorite changes every time I listen to this album, and there's just a song that's an earworm and just I have to learn on guitar. I feel like that's just what's happened like probably 5 times, 6 times with this album with different songs. And I just listened to this album while going on like an hour-long walk. I guess hour and a half long. I was listening to other music as well. And it was just like perfect. It was just like the perfect music to walk along to feel kind of empowered to in an almost like dark way. And I don't know, it's just, it holds a close place in my heart. I wouldn't say this is the best Pink Floyd album, though, which is to say this year is not the best year for music out of all the many years of music, but still very, very good album.
Glad we both had it on our list. I mean, you have to, it's The Wall.
Yeah.
But yeah, so many awesome tracks on that album. Like, even like the ones that aren't necessarily the standouts work so well in the narrative. So. All right, and lastly we get to my number 1. So my number 1 is the album 154 by Wire. So
I've not heard of this one.
So Wire is a post-punk band that is the most incredible, amazing, forward-thinking, and interesting post-punk bands of the time. Their sound is like, the album like Viet Cong by Preoccupations? It's like that sort of music, but like even more complex, more interesting. It's almost like a Slint Spiderland type album. So it's post-punk, but like compared to all the other post-punk I listened to, which was a lot of albums, at least a dozen, this was easily a tier above all of them. Like this was my favorite album of the year, for sure. Every track is so interesting, engaging. Their use of dissonance is so edgy and so like dark. The grooves are so intense and they build on each other so much, almost kind of like in a 2010 Swans type of way. The tracks are mostly short and just like full of energy, and then there's like this one like centerpiece in the middle of the album that's just like a 7-minute track that just builds and builds and builds and adds distortion and adds chaos and adds dissonance and just becomes like this like wall of sound by the end. And there's so many tracks that are just like these like short, hard-hitting kind of like alt rock, post-punk songs that are like so electrifying and so energetic, and the singer's voice has like this sort of like dark edge to it as well. Like really cool stuff. I feel like if you're a fan of Swans, you're a fan of Slint, if you're a fan of like like Cloud Nothing, from also a kind of newer post-punk band, this is like the blueprint for all those bands. Like it's super cool. So I really want to hear more Wire after this because I know they have a very long career. But this was an incredible album, so definitely my number one.
I'll have to check it out.
Yeah. So anyway, that's our video for 1979. In a few weeks, we'll be back with another year.
Yeah, we're gonna just spin on a reel, as we did for this one, and see what happens.
See where it lands.
Yeah.
So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.